Chapter 25, Americans in a World in Crisis, 1933 to 1945. World War II fundamentally changed national institutions and transformed individual behavior. History's greatest armed conflict proved as much a turning point in American personal lives as in world affairs. Gone were the high unemployment and low productivity of the Great Depression and the accompanying doubts about the vitality of American institutions and national purpose. Gone, too, was the world in which the United States played only a peripheral role. The war was a watershed, separating what had come before from what would become the dominant patterns of post-war life. The war destroyed certain traditional American ways and communities and created a new world order that left the United States at the pinnacle of its power and sowed the seeds of a post-war crisis. It was indeed, in Eleanor Roosevelt's words, no ordinary time. During the Great Depression, President Roosevelt had initially pursued a policy that put American economic interests above all other considerations. Roosevelt also declared a good neighbor policy, renouncing any nation's right to intervene in the affairs of another. While the democratic ideals espoused by the good neighbor policy did not hugely affect U.S. relations in Latin America, it did put the United States in an interesting position as it struggled with the decision of whether to enter the coming Second World War. Americans watched the rise of dictators in Germany, Italy, and Japan with a sense of unwillingness to be drawn again into an international adventure. Even those with European powers directly threatened by the rise of Nazi Germany were unwilling to commit to the coming war, and a policy of appeasement aided the rise of Hitler's regime. The memory of the devastation of World War I remained strong, and isolationist sentiment ran high. The Neutrality Acts, passed in 1935 through 37, gave legislative expression to this popular longing for peace. Roosevelt advocated adequate defenses, encouraged naval expansion, and communicated constantly with world leaders, but never pushed ahead of U.S. public opinion. But that climate of opinion was shifting after the Munich Pact. A number of distinguished victims of Nazism found refuge in America. In January 1939, President Roosevelt submitted to Congress a $1.3 billion defense budget. On the chronology, you'll notice a few important events that are germane to U.S. history. You can see 35 to 37, the Neutrality Acts. Also, Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 was elected to an unprecedented third term. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and the United States officially enters the war from there. This map is of European aggression before World War II. Less than 20 years after the end of World War I, war again loomed in Europe as Hitler launched Germany on a course of military and territorial expansion. Out in the Pacific Ocean, you had Japanese expansion before World War II. Dominated by militarists, Japan pursued an expansionist policy in Asia in the 1930s, extending its sphere of economic and political influence. In July 1937, having already occupied the Chinese province of Manchuria, Japan attacked China proper. After war began in Europe, Congress lifted the Neutrality Act's prohibition against the sale of weapons to belligerents and permitted cash and carry. By the summer of 1940, Germany was in control of northern and western Europe, and the Battle of Britain had begun. During this extended air battle and bombardment campaign, the German Air Force, Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe, reduced much of London to rubble before being finally defeated in 1941 by a concerted Allied effort. In the United States, Roosevelt was re-elected to an unprecedented third term. The nation instituted its first peacetime draft and increased defense spending. Congress replaced cash and carry with Lend-Lease, and after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, war aid went to the Russians as well. American naval vessels, although neutral, became more involved in the Atlantic War. In the Far East, Japanese troops, like their German counterparts, proved increasingly aggressive. Japanese commanders were highly capable, with experience in roughly 50 years of Japanese imperial efforts in Asia. Japanese soldiers and pilots were trained in the battles of the Second Sino-Japanese War. giving them an appreciable advantage against other Asian militaries, and particularly the largely unprepared isolationist U.S. military. As the Japanese military expanded their efforts from China into Southeast Asia, the rest of the world slowly began to respond. Japanese assets in the United States were frozen, and trade with China was embargoed. The Japanese chose to retaliate by bombing Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Immediately thereafter, the United States declared war on the Empire of Japan. Honoring their mutual defense treaties, Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States, and the United States declared war on them in kind. This is an image of isolationism versus interventionism. In front of the White House in 1941, an American soldier grabs a sign from an isolationist picketing against the United States entering the war in Europe. A diverse group, isolationists ran the gamut from pacifists who opposed all wars to progressives who feared the growth of business and centralized power that a war would bring, to ultra-rightists who sympathized with fascism and/or shared Hitler's anti-Semitism. In the early morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, Japanese airplanes launched from aircraft carriers attacked the United States fleet moored at Pearl Harbor on Oahu Island, Hawaii. The surprise attack by the Japanese, which brought the United States into World War II, destroyed or damaged 19 ships, including 5 battleships and some 300 planes, and killed 2,335 American servicemen. It was a date which will live in infamy, Franklin Roosevelt told Congress and the nation as he asked for a declaration of war. It would unite the country for the war effort, as well as have long-range and far-reaching consequences for American foreign relations and for American attitudes toward the world. To organize the conversion of industry to war production, Roosevelt created a host of new agencies, such as the War Production Board and the National War Labor Board. The American economy boomed as the government poured out more than $320 billion to defeat the Axis, and the new Office of Price Administration held down wages and prices and instituted rationing to try to stem inflation. The vast majority of military industrial contracts went to a small selection of U.S. industries, increasing both the efficiency of development and a trend toward economic concentration, the effects of which would be felt for decades to follow. Scientific developments were critical to the war. New and more effective ordnance, medical improvements, and of course the atomic bomb helped usher in a new kind of war. Scientific agencies were under the Office of Science and Research Development, and the project to develop the atomic bomb was known by its code name, the Manhattan Project. These next series of graphs highlight some important trends in the economy. This one highlights the growth of gross national product between 1940 and 1945. In a very similar graph, you see wages and salaries increase as well between 1940 and 1945. This graph shows the trend of increasing female employment, where the iconic Rosie the Riveter represented millions of female employees that went off to work while the men were off fighting the war. In a predictable pattern, you see military employment also increase from 1940 to 1945. This is an image of Rita Hayworth aiding scrap drive. One of the many Hollywood stars who used their popularity to aid the war effort, actress Rita Hayworth displays her famous legs to urge Americans to donate scrap metals for the manufacture of military equipment. Through 1942, the war news was bad for the Allies. The Japanese won again and again in the Pacific. In Europe, Stalin urged a second front in the West as Russians held the line at Stalingrad. Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to delay a second front and attack the Germans in North Africa. In 1943 and 44, the Western Allies invaded Italy, launched a massive air war over Germany, and won the Battle of the Atlantic. By mid-1944, the Red Army had cleared the Germans out of the Soviet Union, and the Western Front opened on D-Day, June 6, 1944. In the Pacific, the American strategy of island hopping destroyed Japan's sea and air power by the end of 1944, but the Japanese continued fighting. This pie chart shows World War II military deaths and casualties You can see the United States is here at 291,557, which overall pales in comparison to the 6.1 million in the USSR. Taken as a whole, the casualty rates for the entire war are quite staggering. This is a map showing some of the important locations, some of the important major battles. You won't really have to know a lot of these for the exam, but just to provide some context about where these important battles took place. For U.S. history, obviously, an important date is June 6, 1944, and here's Normandy. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrenders. This image is entitled Full Victory, Nothing Else. Commander-in-Chief of Allied Expeditionary Force General Dwight D. Ike Eisenhower gives the order of the day to U.S. paratroopers in England on the eve of D-Day. Here are some of the major engagements in the Pacific, the island hopping campaign as it was called. On August 6th and August 9th, 1945, you had the dropping of the atomic bombs, which would eventually lead to Japanese surrender. The GIs fighting the war were transformed by the experience in a variety of ways. Some had their personal horizons broadened, others became more distrustful of foreigners, and many were left with lasting psychological as well as physical wounds. On the home front, Americans served as air raid wardens, planted victory gardens, and organized collection drives to recycle paper, rubber, and scrap metal. They purchased war bonds and by thus reducing purchasing power, helped control inflation. The Office of War Information, or the OWI, served as the nation's propaganda arm. Movies, radio, comic strips, and popular music stirred patriotic emotions and emphasized the bestial nature of the enemy. The already mobile American people moved about because of military service and to secure new economic opportunities at the centers of war production, especially on the Pacific coast. Millions of women who had never before worked outside the home found employment in the war industry or in the armed services. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the hardworking, muscular woman helping to carry the Allied war effort to victory by taking over factory and industrial work, is one of the most enduring of the war. Yet, despite the large numbers of women working, very little permanently changed about perceptions of women's role, especially married women in the workplace. Women were viewed as a temporary fix to help the war effort. Women were paid less than men, denied promotions, and largely replaced by men at the end of the war. Even more dramatically, the war opened doors for African Americans. Civil rights spokesmen in 1942, like A. Philip Randolph, insisted that African American support for the war hinged on the United States' commitment to racial justice. This was also known as the Double V campaign, for victory at home and victory abroad. Thousands of Japanese Americans were interned in camps for the duration of the war, often losing all their land and possessions as they were forced to relocate quickly. This is a map of the home front, 1941 to 1945. War-related production finally ended the Great Depression, but it also required many Americans to move, especially to western states where the jobs were. This map shows major war-related industries and the states that gained and lost populations. For Japanese Americans, relocation did not mean new jobs, but a loss of freedom, as they were assigned to one of 10 relocation centers across the country. This is an image of young Nisei evacuees at the Turlock Assembly Center. Awaiting their turn for baggage inspection on May 2, 1942, these children would be interned in remote relocation centers along with 37,000 first-generation Japanese immigrants and some 75,000 native-born Japanese American citizens of the United States. Hastily uprooted from their homes, farms, and stores, most lost all their property and personal possessions and spent the war under armed guard. Unlike the situation during the Great Depression, when women were expected to step aside in the job market to make way for unemployed men, the war brought increased opportunities for women in munitions plants and on assembly lines. Some 400,000 African American women left domestic work as servants in private homes for work in defense plants. Although the great majority of African Americans in the Army served in menial labor, non-combat, segregated units, black units performed admirably in combat when given the opportunity. The 99th Air Force Fighter Squadron, known as the Tuskegee Airmen, gained high marks in action against the Luftwaffe and became one of the most highly respected fighter groups in the Army Air Corps. As the mobilization for war lifted the pall of the Depression for white workers, management and labor joined together to exclude African Americans from the benefits of the war boom. To protest, picketers rallied for defense jobs outside the Glenn Martin aircraft plant in Omaha, Nebraska. The alliance among Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States functioned only in the face of a common enemy. The British sought to maintain their imperial possessions and the balance of power against the USSR on the continent. The Soviet Union hoped to weaken Germany permanently and create a sphere of influence of its own in Eastern Europe. The Allied leaders met periodically through the war. By the time they met at Yalta, the Soviet Union had been victorious in Eastern Europe. American forces were still recovering from the Battle of the Bulge and were facing fanatical resistance from Japan. The Soviets could not be dislodged from their dominant position in Eastern Europe. Victory came in Europe on May 8th, shortly after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. President Harry S. Truman took a tough stance with regard to the Soviets, and when Truman, Churchill, and Stalin met at Potsdam to complete post-war arrangements, the alliance was badly frayed. On August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. The war ended on August 14th. This is an image of Hiroshima after the atomic bomb. Little Boy, the A-bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, incinerated the industrial city, killing more than 60,000 Japanese immediately. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki, suddenly killing another 36,000. These U.S. servicemen, like many others, hearing the news of the atomic bombs and the Japanese surrender, expressed their relief and joy that they would soon be safely coming home rather than having to participate in an invasion of Japan. Most Americans and their government initially responded to the war clouds over Asia and Europe by reaffirming their isolationism. Not until the Japanese attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, more than 2 years after the war in Europe had begun, did the United States enter the fray, and even when it waited until Hitler and Mussolini declared war on it before joining the armed struggle engulfing the world. Once engaged, the Americans rapidly went on a war footing. Mobilization transformed the scope and authority of the federal government, vastly expanding presidential powers. It ended the unemployment of the Depression and made American industry more productive than it had ever been, and made most Americans more prosperous than they had ever been. It accelerated trends toward bigness in business, agriculture, and labor. It involved the military in the economy and education as never before. The war also catalyzed vital changes in racial and social relations, causing fundamental challenges to long-held assumptions about the place for women and blacks. Both arenas intensified prejudices against minorities and women and also broadened educational and employment opportunities that widened their public spheres and heightened their expectations. Fighting and winning the greatest war in history, moreover, restored American faith in capitalism and democratic institutions. It was a vital coming-of-age experience for an entire generation that did much to give post-war American society a confident, can-do spirit, optimistic for the American century that they knew lay ahead. The awesome development and use of an atomic bomb bolstered that spirit and enabled the United States to defeat Japan promptly, to try to force the Soviets to be more manageable, and to avoid an invasion of the Japanese home islands costing untold thousands of American casualties. The mass destruction of the war and total defeat of the Axis, however, brought new crises to cloud the bright dawn of peace. The world's two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, soon squared off in a Cold War that would see the United States play a role in global affairs inconceivable to most Americans just 5 years before.